Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, Donald. And the surfeit of Donald's this afternoon, obviously, in this accent, but here we go. I'm not going to be showing you any slides this afternoon. I wanted to, take a human turn in the conversation this afternoon and talk about two letters, a very technical topic, but in perhaps a human way. That's artificial intelligence. And it's interesting, listening to what SAP and Microsoft are up to, because essentially the top 8 to 10 companies on the planet are AI companies, and they're all tech companies. So in the US, we have Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Apple. They're essentially, if you ask the chief financial officer or the chief operating officer what their strategy was, it would be technically AI, those two letters. Turn to China, Badai, Tencent, Alibaba, they're essentially AI companies. And in Europe, of course, we have SAP, because the technology is always out ahead of the sociology. The sociology, the culture is always behind. We're always in that beta stage. And of course, pedagogy is often the poor third. And the reason why AI is central in the learning sphere now isn't the future tense, it's actually the present and past. Because almost everything you who's listening here today, or any of your learners does almost every day, almost every 5 minutes, is use AI to learn. So if you're using Google, which we all do, that's essentially AI. We've been doing that for 20 years. If you're using social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, you name it, it's all mediated by AI. All those news feeds, timelines are mediated by AI. If, after all this, you sit down and watch Netflix, which we've all been doing to excess, then the whole interface and experience is mediated by AI. Buy something on Amazon, it's mediated by AI. Almost everything we do online is mediated by AI, except learning. Because learning in a strange sort of way is still in the old paradigm, the LMS paradigm of producing what they call learning experiences, which were the multimedia experiences we were producing 30 years ago. And my great fear is that we continue in this mode, producing lots of animations and videos and, lots of loud music and lots of little characters and chasing things around Pac-Man mazes, or using the Pavlovian side of gamification, when actually what the world of artificial intelligence tells us is that you should be using very smart software to make people smarter. And that's what I want to delve into today. How can we use AI to really deliver superior learning experiences? Because learning isn't an event, learning is a process, not an event. And the danger is that we start just shoveling lots of content experiences, lots of multimedia experiences, which is what we've been doing for the last 30 years. Actually, what this shift from LMS to LXP shows is that we're getting smarter about this. We're not just replicating classrooms online. We're doing something much, much smarter. And let me explain what I mean by that. But there's two things about AI before I start. I think as learning professionals, it's really useful to see AI, first of all, as an idiot savant. In other words, it's profoundly smart. It will beat you at poker, chess, Go, computer games. But it's also at the same time profoundly stupid. It doesn't even know it's beating you at any of those things. In other words, it is very good at precision tasks and not general tasks, which is what Sandeep and many of the other presenters have been showing us this afternoon. It's good at targeted tasks. So it's both an idiot savant. I often use the example of my dog, who I've hidden behind the door because he barks a lot. I have a robot vacuum cleaner that comes in and cleans up the whole bottom half of my house. Very smart, has an AI map, and it knows the mapping of my house, and it will clean it optimally. But I have a dog, and if it comes in and does its business on my carpet, it will spread that evenly and mathematically into every corner of my room, because it doesn't know anything. It doesn't know shit, as it were, in that case, literally. But it is an idiot savant. The second really important feature of AI for us learning professionals is the fact that it's competence without comprehension. So don't get sucked into this idea that it's going to be a super smart brain or intelligence of any kind. It's a very competent thing when used well, which is what Microsoft, SAP, Anders Pink, when we're using machine learning and so on. It's competent, it does tasks very well, but there's no consciousness or smart self-reflection behind it all. And that's terribly important to remember as well. But let's take a turn now and talk about real learning, because let's get practical for a moment. There's been a lot of talk this afternoon about workplace, learning in the workflow, and that's supposedly a new thing. It's not new at all, actually. The truth of the matter is this basic truth that we learn most of what we learn informally in the workplace by just doing things. Learning is mostly just incidental. It happens to us. Some of it is actually accidental. Most of it's sort of invisible. We're hardly aware that we're learning in the workflow most of the time. In that sense, it's invisible. We're even learning when we're sleeping, as recent research has shown. So perhaps learning in the workflow should be called sort of learning in the flow of life almost. Nevertheless, there are things in organizations that we have to make sure happen in terms of efficiency, compliance, and so on and so forth. Now, this goes way back. People back in the 70s were using very smart checklists and so on. Marsick and Watkins wrote a really good book in 1990, 31 years ago, called Informal and Incidental Learning in the Workplace. Gloria Gary, Jay Cross in 2006 wrote a book about informal learning, how we learn just as we move through the workplace and from our colleagues and so on, as opposed to these big bundled courses. Now, we need courses sometimes, but most learning is fairly informal. So how does AI help us do this? Well, I want you to just imagine in your mind's eye a learning journey. You've got some learning task, or you're in the workflow. And I think it's important that AI now shapes learning engagement. In other words, how do you actually engage learners in the learning process? It's not enough to simply shove content into an LMS and hope for the best. We have to push content to people. And also, when they want to pull stuff, be very highly responsive and smart about that, not overplaying either, but getting the balance right. So it's terribly important that we see learner engagement, and then there's learner support. We've seen some brilliant examples, for example, of voice and text chatbots supporting learning. The very famous example, perhaps the most famous example, was the Georgia Tech one, where we had 9 teaching assistants, and they swapped one of the teaching assistants out for a bot with 350 AI students, and none of the students spotted it was a bot. In fact, they put it up for the teaching award. Put it up for a teaching award. How weird is that? Then in the second year, when they swapped 2 of the 9 out, the students, of course, were highly aware of this. They actually thought that one of the human tutors was a bot. So there was this sort of, curious mixture between software and humans actually supporting the learning process. So we see that it does actually work in practice. And then some more recent advances in terms of the way AI will help you in your organization and learning is the rise of AI in its use to create learning content. We heard James in the Royal Mail earlier talk about, his team producing those videos and animations and so on. But actually, there's lots that can be done using AI to take a raw document, take a PowerPoint, take a video, and produce online learning at the click of a button. And I don't mean the sort of online learning which is, lots of cute cartoons with some multiple choice questions. I mean the sort of learning that actually uses AI to semantically interpret open answers. Real teachers, real trainers ask people questions and they give open responses, whereas most online learning is stuck in true, false, and drag and drop type questions. So we have the opportunity here to interpret real answers from people and actually do proper assessment and formative assessment using semantic analysis of what they come back with, and then feedback, or as I prefer to call it, feed forward, to propel them in the learning process. So AI can be used to create content. We've heard from Sandeep and others how AI can be used to curate content. In other words, when you go out of the organization and look for TED Talks and the 101 things that people do, when people get stuck, they go to Google and YouTube. But that can be a lot smarter, of course, when it's mediated by AI. And we talked about Anders Pink's use of machine learning, the title, the 1,200 briefings. That's great stuff. But it's all using AI, folks. That's what it is, really. But sticking to this, in the workflow, the moment in need type stuff, because Bob Mosher talks about this a lot. There's both pushing and pulling using AI, okay? Now, a very important feature of AI in the LXP world, certainly, is that little open box, which is search. Now, sometimes this can be a chatbot, doesn't really matter, chatbot or search. That's the most important feature of an LXP for me, because when people get stuck and want a quick fix, the first thing they do is turn to Google. But actually, that's often not satisfying if it's internal content you want. You don't want the sort of search that Google provides, funnily enough. You want a more elastic type of search that interrogates the documents and now videos and graphics within your organization. And that's a different type of search and needs an AI application to do it properly. So when you're in the workflow, let's talk about people for a minute, and they want to find out something new for the first time. Maybe curiosity is driving their learning. They've heard somebody mention something like blockchain. What the hell is blockchain? They want to find out about it. That's a need, and they'll want to pull content in this one. They may just want to learn more about something. They may, be interviewing someone tomorrow. I've done the basics in interviewing, but really want some more process there. They want to apply their learning. They want to solve problems or just change. Just change. I mean, we heard from the Royal Mail. The Royal Mail have just been through this huge PR problem in the UK, and I'm sure that would be something that the organisation needs to really solve, both internally and externally. So sometimes change happens, and those moments in need can only be satisfied. They cannot be satisfied by traditional LMS structure. They have to use very smart AI structures to deliver when people want to pull stuff to them. So that's the pull, okay? But people often talk about those 5 moments of needs and pulling content from learners, but there's also the push side, because organizations are not like real life. You do have to push stuff to people as well, because we've already heard they may have moral, regulatory, legal responsibilities, GDPR and so on. That needs to be pushed. There may be things they don't know. People don't know what they don't know. So we have to get that stuff to them. People procrastinate. Everybody procrastinates. Nobody really wants to learn. This is, one of the great truths here is that actually, how many people just voluntarily skipped onto the LMS and wanted to watch those sort of weird cartoons or click on people's little cartoon heads and get speech bubbles up? Nobody does that in real life. Nobody does that. And everything we see online doesn't follow that pattern. We never do a multiple choice question in any other place other than training. So I think we've got to be a lot smarter about looking at this push techniques. Practice is another one, for example. We know that the great German psychologist in 1885 discovered the forgetting curve. Most of that stuff that people watching on videos are going to forget. It's like a shooting star. You watch a 10-minute video on a topic, and because you've only got a limited 20 seconds window in working memory, you're burning that stuff up behind you as you shoot through the video. By the time you got to the end of the video, you feel as though you've learned something, but actually you haven't, because you've not been actively engaged with learning. You've not had to do much cognitive deep processing. And then there's, of course, the whole application and transfer of learning into real skills. And none of that's solved by cartoons, leaderboards, and the Pavlovian side of gamification. It really isn't, that basic stuff. And my fear here is that learning experiences are just going to be triggering that sort of shallow, illusory learning as opposed to more sophisticated simulation type work, deeper processed learning. And that's where I think the whole AI is bringing new stuff to the table. So we mentioned curation. I think it was Sandeep who very nicely summed this up earlier when he was talking about how curation can happen. Of course, a lot of trainers are doing personal creation and personal curation, looking for stuff. That's a bit of a waste of time. You can spend hours looking for the good stuff. It would be far better either to use a service like Anders Pink, which uses machine learning now, AI, or some sort of playlist system that's pushing stuff to people. So this whole push and pull thing doesn't really need the sort of high-end media and videos and full-length courses that we thought was online learning before. It's far more sensible to think of it in terms of alerts, notifications, emails, in terms of pushes. The sort of nudges, behavioral learning. We in the UK have a whole government department attached to this notion of behavioral science. In other words, how do we really nudge people towards learning? I've seen some great examples of nudge learning. Little 90-second videos with a call to action at the end. A big finance company, merged with another company. They had to get some management training in there. A 60-second video on mentoring. Now you go and pick somebody in your team who's under 30 and start mentoring them and report back on Friday. All that call to action type stuff that we know works well on the web. Then beyond that, the whole job, don't worry too much about the grand world of multimedia. Job aids, checklists, FAQs, automated curation, that works well. The whole micro-learning world is creeping in here because what people want are smaller experiences and not longer experiences, obviously. As we've come back from COVID, a very interesting Gartner report has predicted that 80% of classroom training will not return to the classroom. 80% of classroom. That's all going to be online. All going to be online. But we have to make it smart online stuff. We can't just take that stuff and just slam it into the world of the LMS. Neither should we be slamming it into the world of the LXP. The LXP has to be much more sophisticated in terms of workflow, the learning journeys, the stories that we've heard from Kim and so on. We have campaigns, planned learning, retrieval practice and space practice. I haven't heard that mentioned. Two of the great findings in the science of learning. We know that we forget almost everything. We know the cure is spaced practice. And what do we do about it? Absolutely nothing. So I think we're heading towards a world where these things, pedagogic practices, can be embedded as algorithms and delivered to learners in a meaningful fashion so that they really do learn efficiently and quickly. Now, I want to turn to data for a minute here because we live in the age of algorithms, but data also matters here. And my great fear here also, a bit like the multimedia fear, where we just take a whole load of animations and leaderboards and gamification and shove it into this new world when it's inappropriate. I think the sort of dashboard dazzle thing worries me slightly as well, to be honest. I think dashboards are great. They work well, but they're not an end in themselves. They're always a means to an end. And a lot of dashboard type products are a bit like having a dashboard but not having the car. In actual fact, in my lifetime, the dashboard of a car has shrunk down to two things, really, which is speed and am I running out of fuel? And that's because the car has automated everything else. And when it comes to the use of data, again, I think we should be careful about this dashboard dazzle. I think we should be thinking of data at four levels, really. And this was touched upon before here. But the very, very first level, of course, is just describing what people do, who clicked what, where, and when. That's fine. That's easy to harvest, especially if it's XAPI. SCORM, absolutely hopeless. Thankfully, we're moving out of that. The second one is analytic data, and that was mentioned. So the analysis of data is interesting, using largely statistical techniques. You don't really need AI for a hell of a lot of that. But again, these insights, how do we pick up on those insights and actually apply them through tools? We've seen a good example of that in the previous talk. But what's really interesting to me is the next two levels, beyond description, beyond analysis and insights. And that's into prediction, which is all about the recommendation engines that were happening, what is likely to happen. You can tell what's happened, descriptive, why it's happened, analytic. But actually what really matters is what's likely to happen. How can I help these people navigate through the problems that this organization and these individual learners have? And that's predictive or recommendation engine type work. But the one that's often missed out and is going to be the most important one by far is prescriptive data, the automation of processes. So that's what Netflix and Google do. They just automate the process. You never see a dashboard when you go into Google. You never see a dashboard when you go into Netflix. There's no leaderboards or gamification. What they do is just deliver a service incredibly efficiently because it's personalized. But it's the automation of personalized learning that really has made this world sing. And when I talk about the automation of processes, I mean those learning journeys that were talked about earlier. I mean those really immediate needs that people have in the workflow, because some of those can be predicted, some of them are pooled, but it's that combination of AI. This is AI plus humans working together with incredibly smart software that will change the paradigm, the fundamental paradigm in learning, away from just an LMS towards an LXP. But I'm not against the LMS, of course. This idea that the LMS is dead is, of course, nonsense. If you're running a huge global organization, you really do have to have a lot of LMS-type functionality. But what's happening is the LMSs are moving towards the LXPs, and LXPs, of course, are having to fold in some of the LMS functionality, and you can see that in the SAP roadmaps and so on, and that is great. Now, I just wanted to end on a couple of really sort of weird things, really. So where's all this going? Well, the paradigm shift is already happening. And I'm an investor, so when I invest money or bring investment money to companies, just look at the analyst reports in the learning world now and the valuations that LXP companies are getting. That shift is already happening. All the smart money, smart capital is going in that direction. So this is almost certainly bound to happen. But I want to just look to the stars for a bit on the AI front. Forget about robot teachers and all that sort of nonsense. I think there are some really exciting things happening that may be more blue sky. One is Starlink. I'm surprised this doesn't get more attention. In other words, we will soon have 5G from anywhere on the planet, no blind spots. I go to Africa every year, and I've been working there for a long time. But imagine a world where AI-delivered content can be placed anywhere at a very low cost, anywhere on the planet. That's almost within reach now. It's months and a couple of years away before the whole planet will have such a service. And then there's some really interesting things happened, and one happened only yesterday. I've been following the Neuralink stuff quite interestingly, and that's Elon Musk's company that is using arrays that go into the brain. And they already, it was an astonishing video, which I recommend to everyone, they already have a monkey which was playing Pong, that old computer game, using a little joystick and getting a reward, which was a banana milkshake. Then, using the Neuralink implant, they unplugged the joystick, and the ape carried on playing the computer game Pong very successfully. In other words, it was simply using its thought or brain to control things on the screen. And then we had a very interesting case, which was just this week, really, which was people who could not use their hands, who were literally thinking out words and imagining that they were writing those words, and it was appearing on the screen as typing. Now, we are looking at a future here, perhaps, where we can read and write to the brain. And there's a lot of speculation around this, but some of these things are actually happening now as we speak. Now, imagine a future where we can actually do that, because in all these examples I've just explained here, it's AI that's doing the hard, heavy lifting and interpreting the signals from the brain or the signals that go back to the brain. The AI is doing all the hard work. So imagine a future where, we really can have massive accelerated learning, direct learning to the brain. This sounds a bit science fiction-like, but we're seeing glimpses of where this is going now. So AI isn't just about LXPs. It's changing the whole learning landscape, the whole future of learning. And I'll end on this sentence because I think it's important, because I think AI will change what we learn. I mean, why do we have to learn a lot of stuff if those types of tasks will be replaced by AI and machines anyway? So it changes what we learn. It will change how we learn, and we've seen that with the LXP stuff. And all the stuff I've just described to you, it will change the very way in which we learn. It will also change why we learn. Perhaps, during COVID, it's interesting. I was in Stanford just before COVID, and we spoke to their smart kids, they're all medical students. And when the professors were asking them how they learned, every one of them put Google and YouTube at the top of their list. This is how people learn anyway. They use AI all the time, every 5 minutes. And we'd be foolish to ignore this. We have to look to consumer technology as a way of inspiring what we do in our roadmaps. In the past, we haven't been doing that. We've been giving them what we think is right, rather than looking at the sort of consumer technology that's already using AI to personalize the learning experience. We talked about adaptive learning earlier on. Imagine, just like your sat-nav or your GPS, if you go off course between London and Brighton, where I live, and your sat-nav gets you back on the road again. Imagine an incredibly smart tutor sitting on the side of you. And you know what? That's here with us today. You can buy that off the shelf, which would get you back on course so that you don't fail in maths, which most people, of course, in life do, so that you do proceed in learning a language, because most people fail in learning and attempting to learn the language. And on the ethical side, I would say, don't worry too much about this stuff. It's not as good as you think, as I say. Go back to my example of the idiot savant, and it's not as bad as you fear. It's under our control. There are ethical issues to do with defense and so on, but in the learning sphere, very little to worry about. So remember, learning is a process, not an event. It's a process, not an event. And that process really needs to be driven by the individual, but it's a process of personalized learning. And if you're going to have smart learning, you need smart software. We're no longer in the world of HTML and if-then statements in code. We're in the world of AI already, and this will happen, and it will happen quickly. I'll end there since I've got a couple of minutes for questions, and hopefully my other Donald will have harvested a couple of questions for me there.
Yeah, thanks so much as always, Donald. I've known you a long time, obviously, and always words of wisdom and inspiration. And I think one of the beauties of the presentation today is it's real and it's there, and people can really use some of the advice. I've got a couple of questions, but before we get into that, obviously you've got a book out at the moment, Artificial Intelligence for Learning. Do you want to say a couple of words on that and what you're doing next?
Yeah, everything I've said is in much more detail in this book, Artificial Intelligence for Learning. It's published quite recently. And there's a code available. If you want 20% off for anybody who's listened, then I think Sandeep or Donald, you'll be able to provide that code. It's AHR20 at the Kogan Page website. So Kogan Page is the publisher. There's a little logo down here somewhere. There we are, Kogan Page. And you get 20% and free delivery there. And yeah, and then actually on top of that, I've been writing a book called On Learning Experience Design, which is all about what I've just been saying here. Let's not design learning experiences for the old LMS world and port them over into the LXP world. What's more appropriate is that we're far more sensitive to what AI actually does. And therefore, the learning experience designers have to really pick up on what people really do in the real world, as opposed to what they think they want. And, I was listening to the story about Ian Ford and the leaderboard. That's the last thing I want in my organization, is some obsessive guy who wants to stick at the top of a leaderboard. That's not learning. It's just not to me. I think that's the Pavlovian side of the psychology of learning, the bad side. You want deep cognitive change and behavioral change, that level 4 Kirkpatrick stuff, and that's hard. It's really easy to be illusory and produce illusory learning. Anyway, any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, one. I'll do a couple, and then we'll because we've got a fantastic speaker at the end. So, how do you measure the accuracy and effectiveness of AI machine learning recommendations, especially when we don't have complete control over the algorithms used by providers?
Yeah, well, let's take a real example there. We use Google, and I do a lot of research. I use Google Scholar all the time. And the proof of the pudding really is in the results, and you can measure the results here. Of course, you can actually benchmark this stuff. So when you're involved in building AI tools, which I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years, you have a data set, you do your machine learning. There are very often benchmark tools on the web which are open source sometimes, and you can go and put your algorithm to the test using a pre-existing data set, for example. And so, in many ways, that actually what lies behind that question is there bias in the AI? I'm often confused by this question, because every year we're all biased. I have a book by Daniel Kahneman, and he got a Nobel Prize for it. We have about 50 innate biases. We're all sexist, we're all racist, we all have confirmation bias. Trainers, teachers are all biased. AI has bias in the data, but it's built on statistical models. And the science of statistics is all about getting rid of bias. You talk about mathematical bias. So I think we have a chance in AI, at least, of diminishing or reducing bias in a way we cannot with human beings. So that's a great hope. But it's measurable because you can benchmark it against other systems, and you can, of course, compare them to human systems. And believe me, they're often far superior, and of course, they're massively quicker and cheaper and scalable.
That's great. And I've got one final question, and I dread to ask this because I've seen some of your blogs on the subject, but how do you think the European Union's proposal on regulating AI will impact the use of AI in learning?
Well, to be fair, I think a more important group is the IEEE, but I think they're much more sophisticated because they don't have the politics that the EU has. I think it's unfortunate for me, the AI landscape in Europe is sadly not one of innovation. I think that's the truth. All the innovation, all the papers I read come from either China or North America. And the EU has taken this regulator role in AI. They say that they're also, in favor of innovation, but the rhetoric is all about ethics and AI. It's all about that. And so if we continue to regulate the thing, we'll frighten people off in Europe, or we make SME-type innovation out of the marketplace. Who's from the EU is that they've sort of excluded SMEs from this type of legislation. But God, did that take some lobbying. I was involved in lobbying MEPs. I'll tell you the story. I was in Berlin. I was working with these guys in Berlin. We had to fax them. The only way you could get to an MEP, because they all have secretaries so you can't email them. They never read the emails. They won't get back to you. But they all had fax machines, which they sort of used as a secret network. So that was how bad some of the politicians in the EU were over this issue. But thankfully, they have a very good experts group. The document that was leaked is not half bad, but overall the politics is one of negativity, of more money being spent in AI and ethics than AI sometimes in universities. People wanting transparency in algorithms. So you're not going to use Google Scholar because you don't know how the algorithm works. I don't think so. So I think we need to calm down a little bit about this and be a bit more pragmatic and practical.
Fine words indeed, Donald. Fine words indeed. And thank you so much for attending. A lot of questions around how they can get a hold of the book in the Q&A. I know that Sandeep will absolutely make sure everybody's got not only your details of your current book and the discount code, but also where they can get a hold of the next book and the kind of timelines on that. So thank you once again, Donald. Hugely appreciate your time and supporting the conference today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks, Donald.